Do you ever feel that your art is missing something or that it feels just a little bit plain? Every artist goes through a phase where their art lacks that little oomph, that little spark that makes people go, oh, how cool when they see it. But you can add that little spark in minutes and the difference is drastic. So in this video, I'm going to show you the simple steps that I've taught thousands of students to make their art more captivating and how it'll enable you to create a distinctive style to make your art stand out from the crowd. Once you understand these concepts, with a little bit of practice, you'll be able to add them in minutes. And to help speed up that process, I'm going to share a special shortcut for the digital artist to make it even faster and easier. So, what makes the difference between these two images? Clearly there's more details, but it's not just random. I didn't just have a gut instinct of where it would be good to add those details. Once I had my sketch, it was very clear and obvious where I needed to add more details because it added shading. But how do you know where to put those shadows? That depends on what type of shadows you want to include. And there's actually several distinct types of shadows that you can add. Now, I go super in depth with my students, but for now, let's just go over the most important ones. You and I both know how light works, right? So when light hits an object, that part that's close to the light is bright, and the part that's away from it is in shadow. Duh. This is the first type of shadow though, and we call this a form shadow because it's the shadow that helps define the shape of the object itself. Adding these types of shadows is what makes our drawings look 3D. In this case, it makes our putty ball look round. It's the difference between a circle that's line work and one that actually looks like it's 3D. Now, our putty ball is also creating a shadow on the ground, and this is called a cast shadow. You might also overhear it referred to as a drop shadow. You can think of cast shadows as shadow puppets.
Okay, but putty balls are boring. Let's look at an illustrated example. Hit pause and see if you can spot where some of the form shadows in this illustration are. So this shadow right here makes the hat look round. I've also added some shadows to the lemons right here, to the basket right here, and even to the board right along here. Okay, now how about some of the cast shadows? Can you spot where those are? So this shadow right here makes the hat look like it's sitting on the blanket. And you'll also see a cast shadow from the board right here, and the picnic basket right here, and the jug right there.
Okay, not bad. Let's take it up a level. Maybe you noticed in our putty ball here that the shadow isn't a solid color. It actually gets lighter towards the back here. Why? Well, when light hits the ground, it bounces up and off of it and onto the objects around it. This is easier to see if we bring in a sheet. See how much this light bounces around up onto the ball and the shadow? Now, some areas are really hard for the light to get at. The space really close to the ball, it's not getting any bounce light in there at all. And we call this occlusion, where the light just can't get in and it gets super, super dark. All right, let's go to an illustrated example. If we look at her nostril here, you can see that hardly any light is getting in there at all, so it's very, very dark. The same is true of this section right under her eyes. Hardly any light is getting in there, and so it creates a really dark line there. It could almost look like an outline. In fact, that's how I've drawn these eyes. So I've added some shading along here to make the eyelid itself look round, and then I've added a dark line right here to create that occlusion shadow inside of there. You'll notice I did a similar thing in between her lips, and of course I used really dark shadows in her nostrils because, well, there's hardly any light getting in there. Now I can see you starting to sweat and thinking, oh my gosh, there's so many shadows everywhere, my drawing is so complex, this is going to take ages to add all these shadows. Wait, stop. The goal is to make this easy. You do not have to add shadows to everything. For example, in this image, I didn't add shadows to everything. In fact, there's virtually no cast shadows in the items in the windows. So how do you know when it's a good idea to add shading and when it's unnecessary? I add shading when I want something to look more interesting, when I want to draw more attention to it. I especially like to add shading when something looks boring. For example, here's this image without shading on the walls, and here it is with. Can you see how the shading helps make the panels here just pop out so much more? All right, once you've added shadows, there's a second step that doesn't take a lot of effort, but boy, does it make a big difference. Can you spot what it is? It's this tiny speck of light called a highlight, and adding that will take your eyes from dead to sparkling with light. Also, side note, can you spot what type of shadow this is? It's a cast shadow created by her upper lid on the eye. Now you might be tempted to think that highlights are just the opposite of shading. Just add lighter areas instead. But there's one major way that drawing highlights is totally different.
So highlights are lights that are reflecting off of a surface. So the type of surface that highlight is on, it's going to change the way the highlight looks. Surfaces like water, metal, or glass, well, these highlights right here are going to be way more harsh. Like you can see, this highlight is practically a white line. Whereas in this soft material in the yarn, you see right along here, the top part of this is a really light, gradual highlight. And the bottom is more in shadow. Whereas the metal crochet hook, well, that highlight is really, really harsh compared to the highlights in the thread.
But let's be real, you can still end up with amateur-looking art if you add shadows and highlights to your art. So what's the difference between unique, eye-catching shading that makes our art stand out from the crowd versus childish beginner art? Well, it's all to do with this, baby. We all want more of this for our art, right? Okay, but it's not actually about money, but rather money uses a popular style of shading. And that's what this is all about, adding style to our shadows. There's several distinct styles of shadows that we can use, so let's go over some of the most popular ones. So money uses hatching and cross-hatching. Depending on how close or far apart these lines are, it creates the illusion of dark shadows or lighter areas. You can also play with how thick those lines are to create that sense of dark and light areas. Another popular style of shading is called stippling, where you add a lot of little dots to an area. My favorite tattoo artist, Susa, who also goes by Suflanda on Instagram, uses stippling. So stippling can take several different forms. So in the rabbit here, it's more short lines versus in the dress, it's more like dots. The downside of these two styles, cross-hatching and stippling, hand cramps. See, it can take a lot of time to each and every one of those little lines and little dots. But I have a shortcut that I'm going to share with you in just a minute. But first I want to say, if you don't like being boxed in and stuck to one style, that's no problem. You can absolutely mix and match different styles. For example, in this piece, Susa is creating stippling, and she's also used hatching to create some shading. And Van Gogh creates this weird hybrid between stippling with these really short dashes, but also it's kind of like hatching. The next style is my personal favorite, but I have to warn you, if you aren't careful with this one, your art can end up looking totally amateurish.
This style is called a gradient, and it uses color. The color itself either gets darker or lighter in a smooth transition. Let's simplify this image down and zoom in a bit. So if I look at the finger, you can see that the tip is a bright light, and as it gets further down, it gets a little bit darker. Same thing in the ribbon. So it's dark right here, but right here, it's transitioning lighter and lighter until it's the lightest color of all. Now, many beginners, when they start with digital art, will want to grab a soft airbrush, thinking that'll be the fast and easy way to add shadows. But the resulting look sometimes looks not very good. See, the best gradients have an interesting texture. For example, in this piece, you'll see that the background has some interesting textures here and here. Even the cup has some textures, and even in the plate, it's not a smooth gradient. There's a textured look.
Now, you could spend hours painstakingly trying to add the stippling and cross-hatching or manually adding interesting textures to your gradients. But I've made a shortcut that'll allow you to add those dots with a simple stroke, and the good news is it's totally free. It's my Procreate shading brushes, and you can download them for free in the link below.